happy because everybody has recognized how important borders are. And I've I'm from the border and tried to study the border in so many different places, and now to hear it said and repeated so many times how important borders can be in different scenarios. I'm very happy with that prospect. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about my research, which is to try to reproduce the cultural pattern of the Spanish borderlands in North America, which is essentially Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and that's part of the U.S. during the Spanish period. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the research questions, some of the theoretical constructs that we read about the area, the aspects of the research and sources I've consulted, the model and the specifications, and then can complexity science, that is the tools that we've been talking about today, help in terms of understanding this borderlands, how they're formed, and what they constitute. Okay, so the first question, the most difficult, is how to define culture. And there are so many different ways and meanings to define culture, both positive and negative. But the perspective I'm going to take in this exercise is how culture is operationalized, how we come to create a culture. So I'm looking more at the interactions that comprise a culture and how we can better understand this intangible. So, in terms of the Spanish borderlands, hotly disputed concept because it has very Eurocentric connotations. That is, firmly delimited political borders are a characteristic of the nation state or an empire, which are Western ideas. So, contesting and delimiting them in terms of the historiography has always been an issue. In the historical context, borderlands are ambiguous at best. Before 1492, the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans represented barriers that seemingly were insurmountable, limiting Spain and other European countries to interactions with contiguous landmasses. The age of exploration changed this view, and soon it was found that a larger landmass existed to the west, but the scale of the territory was unknown. So between 1492 and 1825, the Spanish colonial period, waves of exploration followed by conquest and settlement extended Spain throughout, and the context throughout what we now know as the Americas, north and south. So the need to define these territorial limits and spheres of influence became important to the Europeans, prompting increasing expeditions of measure to describe the settled lands, the areas and their external forces, and the disputes of ownership were important. The geographical nature of the region was also important, and the terms borderlands became a common way of describing the region. The key point is that distant from centers of power, remote beyond any stretch of the imagination, these regions functioned basically autonomously. In the case of the Spanish borderlands in North America, the historiography treats them basically as an adjunct of the United States, an empty space awaiting its manifest destiny. Yes, and then this is changing now because we have a new group of historians, new West historians, who are challenging this perspective. In the case of Latin American history, it's only recently that we see the research starting to incorporate the region into Latin America. So in many respects, the borderlands, these borderlands have been studied, yes, but they have also been marginalized from many disciplines. Okay, so what I propose to do is to study Santa Fe, New Mexico during the colonial period. To understand how the interactions between indigenous and European settlers came to form this cultural complexity that we call the Spanish borderlands. Beyond this, I think it serves as a baseline study for future work on how that system will evolve over time as the landscape is modified and as human interactions also change. In order to accomplish this goal, I propose to use the theories and methods of complexity, and I also propose to consult the primary and the secondary sources. The cultural aspects of these interactions, for the purposes of this particular study that I'm working on, are defined along very broad goals, terms: demographic, economic, political, administrative, social, and geographical. So those are the broad terms that I'm using. Now I believe you can change the slide. Okay, so the primary sources. This is just a short summary of the sources that are available. They all contain a number of similar elements. The nature of material existence, that is the economic, the religious habits of the residents, the culture to include language, social norms, gender distribution, the political, administrative, organizational structures, such as pueblos versus tribes, nomadic tribes, and they all also describe a landscape that is sometimes mythically wealthy, other times completely uninhabitable. So we see these stories coming out of the primary material. The other thing we see is that the encounters between the Spaniards and the Native Americans took cordial or violent or cooperative in nature. They had these forms. So I take that, and then I also am looking at the secondary literature, the next slide, which goes in a little bit deeper and analyzes all of these aspects from the different disciplinary boundaries. And I list a few here and the mix of what they're offering. Okay. Now the modeling project itself, I'm basing on a couple of examples that we've seen in the literature and other work. And the one that I was most interested in is the Anasazi cultural complex, which basically is trying to reproduce a pattern that already is recognized to exist in the anthropological and the archaeological information. So it is Joshua Epstein and Robert Axtell who designed this and create this, and they're basically looking at the collective behaviors of groups, group formation, cultural transmission, combat, trade, how they emerge, how they transform over time. Other examples that I've based my work on are Thomas Schelling and his work on how segregation or cultural patterns form, and Axtell and Hammond and their models of ethnocentrism. And that last model is particularly relevant as well because it includes games of prisoner's dilemma, which is a way of trying to model or simulate cognitive aspects of the agents. Okay? Now, what I propose to do is to use proxy labels that I'm gleaning from the primary and secondary literature. For example, the demographics may be represented by male, female, economic by hunter or agriculturalist, social by language, Spanish or a native language. I also propose that each individual or each agent in the model possess a set of cultural characteristics, and they're given simple rules of interaction, and they interact also with the landscape that's present. The point of the study, I hope, is to understand the process of mestizaje or ethnogenesis or morphogenesis or syncretism or hybridity or whichever of those words is appropriate for this type of activity. I don't know, and I don't think I want to go there. Anyway, and hopefully to understand cultural blending at the edge of state, empire, or these boundaries that we've been talking about today. So, the beta model itself incorporates the language component and an economic component. What we've done, thanks to Fernando, who's done all the hard work actually, is give each agent a cultural characteristic. They are allowed to move in a region that has actually got a map of the Grand Canyon on it. So they're operating in an environment, a predetermined environment. The rules are decision-based to some extent. They're collaborating with the neighbors around them or determining in terms of their relationships what they can get from the neighbor and whether or not that increases their wealth or not. So it's kind of economistic in its determination. And then they proceed to interact. And what I'm hoping is that somehow or some way there will emerge some cultural expression of this mestizaje. So I've only got two elements in the model. So to put the model. Yeah.